You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
I am really thrilled to be joined by Anne Applebaum. She is, of course, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, journalist, and commentator. She carries the burden of a person whose work is essential to this moment in our history. She's a staff writer for The Atlantic, the author of many really important books like Gulag, A History, and the must-read and now out in paperback Autocracy, Inc. Her work, it helps us see what's right in front of us, but is so cleverly masked. She studied and reported on the rise and fall of totalitarian regimes, the challenges democracies face, and the forces at work to undermine American democracy right now. She is, to this century, what Hannah Arendt was in the last, the person who best helps us understand how a free people might surrender their freedom. And that makes her work so unbelievably essential to the moment we find ourselves in right now. And I'm very grateful, Anne, that you have joined us.
No, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I am, as you could probably tell by that introduction, in awe of your work. But many in our audience aren't familiar with it. And I've struggled a little bit as I got ready for our conversation and how best to use your time. And I think we might do well to begin with something everyone understands in their gut and then build on the connections to the moment we're in from there. And happily, it's something you cover in Autocracy, Inc., and that thing is greed and corruption. I mean, I'm talking to you from Chicago, where we have quite a history of that. But there's something different about the greed and corruption you write about. And it's, at some point, petty grift turns into a system of control. Can you talk about that and its role in autocracies?
Yes. So in my book, I actually use the word kleptocracy, and it's not that common a word, so maybe worth explaining. What it means is a political system that is based on and organized around theft. In other words, the people who are very wealthy, the oligarchs, the businessmen close to the regime, they aren't rich because they've invented a better mousetrap or because they're entrepreneurial. They're rich because of their political connections. So when you talk about a country like Russia, for example, the wealthy Russians are wealthy because of their connection to the oil and gas industry, because of their relationships to the Kremlin. Of course, people who work for the Kremlin are also rich because of their relationship to the businessmen. And the political system, Russian foreign policy, Russian domestic policy, is organized around enriching those people. And this political system, you can now find versions of it. I mean, I don't want to be overgeneral because it varies from country to country. You can now find versions of this in all over the world, and especially in dictatorships. And what we've also begun to see in the last decade is that the kleptocracies begin to work together. In other words, the quasi-state, quasi-private companies in one country invest in the quasi-state, quasi-private countries in another. These are economic ties, which are also political relationships. They help one another get around sanctions in some cases. They help one another evade export restrictions. For example, you can see there's a very strange relationship between Iran and Venezuela, for example, two countries that don't have anything in common historically or culturally, but are related because they have a common interest in producing oil and getting access to oil technology, even though both countries are under sanctions. And so the kleptocracies have begun to work together. And that's one of the main themes of my book, actually. Where did this system come from? How did it develop? And then I'm sure you'll want to talk about this further, how the Western world, Europe and America, originally facilitated the rise of this system, what we can do about it now, and of course, is the United States at risk of developing into something similar?
Yeah, you bet I want to talk about that. But before we get to that, in your book, you describe, and thank you for starting with this kleptocracy. You describe this, this contemporary incarnation of autocratic state as a network of the corrupt financial structures, advanced surveillance, full-time propagandists, and as you said, they work together internationally. Can you explain just go through all of those elements a little bit, and then we'll get to how we facilitated it and where we are?
Sure. Well, I spoke a little bit about kleptocracy, but you're right. There are other ways in which modern autocracies also work together. And I should say from the beginning, I'm talking about countries that do not have the same ideology. So this is not the Cold War, and they aren't working from the same playbook, and they don't meet in some secret room together. When we're talking about Russia or Iran or North Korea or China or Zimbabwe, these are different systems with different that use different language, but they do have a few things in common. And one of the things they have in common is that all of them feel threatened by the language and rhetoric of democracy, of rule of law in particular, of transparency, of accountability. And all of them have come to see that language, and of course the language of human rights, and all of them have come to see that language and those ideas as major, even existential threats to themselves. So they understand that people can be moved by a desire for justice or a desire for freedom or a belief that courts should be fair to everybody and not always favoring, the politically powerful. And they therefore fight against these ideas wherever they come from. And that includes inside their own countries and around the world. And towards that end, they have developed a kind of a form of recognizable authoritarian propaganda. Again, not the same everywhere, but often with similar themes. I think we're all by now familiar with the Russian version, which we see all the time, actually, in U.S. social media and European social media, sometimes as Russian, sometimes disguised as something else, pushing, far right and extremist language, arguing, mocking and making fun of democratic institutions, seeking to undermine trust. All these things these are deliberate projects. The Russians were the leaders of it, but you now have almost every authoritarian country deploy some of the same tactics. So the Venezuelans have a set of international broadcasters that do this work in Latin America. The Iranians have something called Press TV, which promotes very similar themes. In my book, I trace actually a few themes and conspiracy theories that all these countries have promoted. A good example is at the very beginning of the war of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there was a false conspiracy theory about so-called biolabs, supposedly laboratories in Ukraine that were supposed to be producing biological weapons. This was a Russian conspiracy theory, but it was picked up by the Chinese. It was broadcast on Chinese state media and on Chinese international media all around Africa and Asia. It was picked up by the Venezuelans. It was picked up by the Iranians. I found it in the Arabic language. I found it in all kinds of places all over the world as these different sources of authoritarian propaganda follow and repeat one another. And again, I don't think this is an organized process. They simply learn the techniques and the strategies from one another. So they share kleptocratic goals. They share propaganda goals. And increasingly, they share military and geostrategic goals as well. And I think we've seen this most clearly in the war in Ukraine, where Iranian drones and weapons, North Korean ammunition, and even North Korean soldiers, and Chinese trade in parts and components have all enabled Putin in his ability to fight the war. You now see the autocrats coming to one another's aid when they're fighting wars, when they're in trouble, bailing one another out. Maduro, the dictator of Venezuela, would almost certainly not be in power if he didn't have Russian weapons, Iranian money, Chinese investment. All all of them help one another to remain in power. And so again, it's not an alliance. It's really a network, and they have come to cooperate in all different ways in order to maintain their power, maintain their fortunes, and to the extent they can to undermine the democratic world as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're describing a mobster world, where people have power without ideology, without any goal other than staying in power and amassing as much wealth as they can by whatever means they can.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. I mean, some of them do have ideologies. I mean, the Chinese have an ideology that matters to them, or at least to some of them. But it's true that when you look at what they do, a lot of what they do is about protecting their own power and wealth and enriching people around them, enriching their families, enriching their friends, creating oligarchs who are then dependent on them and who can then do favors for them. I don't know, purchase media companies for them or carry out foreign policy goals on their behalf. So yes, it's a world of people whose main interest is themselves and their power. And of course, but that also means that their main interest is not the prosperity or the happiness or the success of their nations. So what happens to their own people is less important. And actually, I should say that I think for this reason, we found them for a long time hard to understand. So we're used to thinking, until recently anyway, we were used to thinking in the democratic world that the point of being in politics was, to increase your country's wealth and make it more prosperous, or, to make your country more successful. That's not, for example, how Putin sees his task. He doesn't care if ordinary Russians are prosperous. His goal, he has different goals, and they're about him. They're about his clique. They're about his power. In his case, they're also about his fantasies about history.
Well, I mean, that's not new, right? Napoleon described his soldiers as cannon fodder, right?
Sure, no, it's absolutely, it's not. It's not new. It's just in contrast to the way we've been used to thinking about politics for the last 40 years.
Yeah. Ours was an exception for a while. So you raised earlier this very intriguing and terrifying line of thought that you track in your book about how we enabled this to rise in the world. You want to talk about that?
Sure. I mean, let me say that in the 1990s, when we first opened up trade to Russia and China, many of the people who did so at the time did it in good faith. And there was, I think, a genuine belief that was based on the historical experience of the collapse of communism and also of the integration of Europe after the Second World War. There was a belief that trade and economic relationships between the democratic world and the authoritarian world were not only good, could be profitable, but would also help create better relationships, maybe create peace, maybe even spread the ideas of democracy as we used to say, from west to east. And I think people genuinely believe that. I think it was. I
remember people saying, trade is going to bring democracy to China. And I was like, I had worked in China. I'm like, I don't think so, but okay.
To be fair, there were Chinese who believed that, just as there were Russians who believed it. And so I think it was even possible to say, certainly in the early days, that if nothing else, trade opened up China and made China, there was more movement, there were more possibilities for people, there was more, there were more options for ordinary Chinese people. So I'm not sure that it was, that was initially wrong. So that did, but I think what happened is that as time went on, the leaders of these regimes, and this is especially true of Russia and China, but you can look farther into the autocratic world as well, began to understand that yes, it was possible that trade was opening things up, that people were being exposed to new ideas, and that therefore the ideas of democracy and of the rule of law and of rights were becoming a problem for them. And were becoming dangerous to them. And I think Putin understood this already in the early 2000s. I think the Chinese began to understand it too. And you see there's a very important turning point. In Russia, it comes in 2014 with the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, when young Ukrainians went out on the street protesting against their authoritarian president who was breaking their constitution. And they waved EU flags and they waved signs about anti-corruption, and they won. Their president became frightened. This is President Yanukovych, and fled the country. Putin looked at that and he saw his worst nightmare. This is exactly what he was afraid of, is that kind of language and that kind of energy overthrowing him. And this is when he began to push hard. I mean, he'd been moving that way for a while, but he began to push much harder in the other direction. And this, of course, is when he launched his first invasion of Ukraine. Around about 2013, you can see the same movement happen in China. So in that year, famously, the Chinese Communist Party issues a document. Famously, it's called Document Number 9. And this document lists the major threats to the Chinese Communist Party. And number 1 on the list is Western constitutional democracy. And also on that list is civil society and I think independent media and other things that we recognize as part of our political system. And this idea that these institutions pose a threat to the party is part of the rise of Xi Jinping. He identifies these things as a problem, and he begins both inside China to push back against them in propaganda and using repressive techniques, and also around the world. So the Chinese begin to argue back against the idea, for example, of universal rights, which, they de facto accepted as part of the UN system, and they begin trying to undermine that idea. They begin criticizing the idea of human rights. They try to take human rights language out of international institutions. And so on. So they also begin to identify these ideas as a threat to their power.
How did we respond to that?
We didn't really respond. It took some time, I think, before the leaders of Europe, the leaders of the United States, and other democracies around the world understood this shift. So, I mean, again, I'm exaggerating. Of course, there were some people who understood it because I wrote about it. Others understood that these changes were happening. But the problem is that the trading relationships between Europe and America and China and especially between Europe and Russia and in the oil and gas had become so important and so economically significant that it became very, very inconvenient and unpleasant to acknowledge that this change had shifted. In other words, that through building pipelines with Russia, we weren't, building a more peaceful world. In fact, what we were doing was enriching oligarchs who then had malign intentions towards Europe and who sought to undermine the European Union and destroy NATO. And so it took a number of years and really quite an amazingly long period of time for people to recognize this. So even after the invasion of Crimea in 2014, the Germans did not want to recognize the damage that they were doing to themselves and to Europe that came from the Nord Stream pipelines and the rest of their economic relationship with Russia.
Do you think we were distracted as well by our post 9/11 wars around the world, and that was our focus, and our international relationship building was focused on building coalitions to fight those wars, and it took our eye off of values that were really the global fight.
There is no question that we were distracted by the war on terrorism, and that because of that, we misunderstood changes that were happening inside Russia and China. I also think that in the course of the war on terrorism, in different ways, and this is maybe a longer conversation for another time, we also contributed to the decline of global legal institutions and international institutions that we chose to ignore. both as this has happened in the context of the invasion of Iraq, but also in other areas.
Yes, like our pioneering use of drones all over the world. Yeah.
Others were also using drones. I mean, but the kidnapping of people and breaking international law in a number of ways. I mean, this contributed to the decline of international law that we're still experiencing the results of today.
So inexorably, this leads to Russia's full-on invasion of Ukraine and a West that's not prepared to respond. I think the United States initially did, but we've backed off a little bit in this administration. No,
so
it backed up a lot.
Actually, the U.S. response in 2022, the Biden administration's response to the invasion, was much more robust and much more vigorous than I think anybody expected, maybe including that administration itself. It was not immediate. I mean, there was immediate aid for Ukraine at the time of the invasion. And then over the next year, there was this kind of bumping up of the kinds of weapons we were willing to share. We weren't initially willing to share certain kinds of weapon systems. And then over time, we were, as we understood what the scale of the invasion was and the appetite of the Russians to keep going. The Biden administration's contribution to the war, not only in its giving weapons to Ukraine, but also in its organization of the rest of the democratic world, the so-called Ramstein process, where the U.S. led a huge coalition. Actually, I think at one point it had more than 50 countries, European, but also Asian democracies and others who were, the U.S. coordinated financial and military aid to Ukraine, helped the Ukrainians with intelligence, helped them understand the battlefield. All that was incredibly important and very, very significant, and I should say was not anticipated or expected by Russia at all. The Russians did not think we would do it, and they didn't expect it. And one of the reasons why the war that was supposed to be over in 3 days lasted instead for 3 years was because of the Biden administration's incredible contribution. I mean, I say that even though in the end, it wasn't enough. I mean, we were never quite fast enough. There was never quite enough available. We hadn't counted or expected the war to be as intense as it was, and so on. I mean, there are plenty of people who are critiquing Biden for all of that. Yeah. But by comparison to the current administration,
let's get to the policy. Current one in a second. I'm sorry for interrupting, but it was almost as if an aggressive war in Europe reminded at least some in America of the things that we forgot during the war on terrorism and during the rush to globalize and reap global profits and that interconnectivity from the 90s. We sort of lost in that period this sense of it really is the democracy isn't going to float around the world on its own. It is a constant battle, and there are values that we stand for, and we lost that. It was as if we got it back a little bit, seeing this war in Europe, but always in America, whether it was Tucker Carlson doing Russia's bidding, there was this undermining of that idea. And then we get to this administration.
So the undermining of the idea was not an accident. I mean, the Russians have been conducting for more than a decade, a program of, manipulation and propaganda aimed at the United States and aimed at Europe that was deliberately designed to undermine faith in democracy and democratic institutions. And I should say, it's not as if they were manipulating innocent people. They had willing listeners. There were people like Carlson, like J.D. Vance and others who were willing to take up and use their ideas for their own purposes. So, so in a way, it was a kind of joint effort. It wasn't the Russians by themselves, but there was an effort aimed very squarely at the foundational ideas and values of democracy that was designed to undermine the American effort in Ukraine, undermine America's alliances, and indeed to undermine Americans' faith in democracy itself. And we see many of the fruits of that effort today. It was very, in some ways, astonishingly successful.
We had turned to the U.S. a little bit, and you were about to talk, you were beginning to talk about the aspects of the Fed that aren't taught in civics class. And I want to tell you that when you said it, I'm like, do we still teach civics class? But I took your point.
So there's another important aspect of the attack on the Fed that I want to underline, because one of the aspects of democracy, one of the things that makes democracies work, is something that's not taught necessarily in civics classes, assuming there are civics classes anywhere that are still taught. And that is the importance to democracies of independent and nonpartisan institutions that maintain a certain structure and a certain level playing field, no matter who's in power. And obviously the courts are most famously this. Theoretically, the courts don't answer to whoever is the president. The courts derive their arguments from the Constitution and from the law. Same is true of the civil service. We have in the United States, or we have had until now, an independent, nonpartisan civil servants whose members may belong to the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, but it doesn't matter. They're still chosen and promoted for their expertise in controlling pollution or making sure that our food is safe, or that they understand how vaccines work, for example. Okay, so we've had these independent institutions. The Fed was one of those institutions that it made its decisions about the economy not based on political influence or what was good for the election of the president in power, but based on what was good for the American economy. And by seeking to undermine the Fed, and by the way, all these other institutions, the civil service, a host of institutions, attacks on the courts, by seeking to undermine these things, Trump is trying to personalize and politicize the federal government in a way that it will help him and will work for him. So instead of our foreign service officers or our civil servants working for Americans, or instead of our army fighting on behalf of the American Constitution, he wants to make all of those people and organizations work on his behalf for his political interests, maybe for his financial interests, maybe for his family's interest or his friends' interests. And that is fundamentally disastrous for American democracy, because what you need to have to preserve democracy, as I said, is this level playing field, that when you have an election, okay, someone gets to rule for 4 years, and they get to, make decisions for 4 years. And then at the end of the 4 years, we have another election, and, the other party is able to win. The federal government, in the meantime, is a set of neutral bodies that can be used or for whom policy can be made by one party or the other, but they are not personally loyal to the president. And this change that Trump is trying to inflict on our political system is the same kind of incredibly dangerous change that we see other dictators in other parts of the world, whether in Turkey or in Venezuela or in Hungary, have also inflicted on democracies.
I pay attention to the practice of politics, not just the policies and the kind of forces you write about in your book. And in practice, back in 1970, a guy named Kevin Phillips taught the Republican Party that it can become the major party in the country by collecting the largest group of animosities inside it. And that led to the Southern strategy, and it's led to 50 years of Americans demonizing each other in order to win elections. And a little bit of that had always gone on, but it became the practice of politics. And I think that weakened us. And I'm interested in your thoughts about how we became less resilient to autocratic takeovers.
So I actually believe that the fundamental change arrives with social media. And that the ease with which people accepted and absorbed conspiracy theories and false narratives on social media, which it simply enabled a different form of communication. Really, it changed not only us, but it changed really every country in the world. And I know this because I know that Americans always like to think of themselves as exceptional and to find every explanation for modern American politics, deep in the roots of American history or the Civil War, Reconstruction. But actually, a lot of what's happened inside the United States, the polarization, the spread of deliberately false information, this is exactly what's happened in other places. I lived part of the time in Poland. I have done for 30 years. And one of the most remarkable things for me has been the growing similarity of Polish and American electoral politics. These are countries that have nothing in common, no history in common, no demography in common, no economics in common. Nothing is similar. And yet there is remarkably similar language being used in both places, remarkably same kinds of political arguments, same culture wars, same everything. And that I have to attribute to the change in the nature of information, which I think is really the primary shift.
That's important. I mean, I guess I take some comfort in that because Poland managed to recover its democracy, and maybe we can too.
We'll see.
We'll see. So I want to read you a quote from FDR in 1938. Because I also think we had some problems after the 2008 financial crisis and the growing wealth gap. He said in 1938, I venture the challenging statement that if American democracy ceases to move forward as a living force seeking day and night by peaceful means to better the lot of our citizens, fascism will grow in strength in our land. His insight was that people have to understand their government is really fighting for them, and they have to feel that their lives are getting better or will be vulnerable. And I get a sense that, at least for a couple of generations, that's not been the case.
It's not been the case, although, again, given the nature of modern media, the question always has to be, were people really worse off, or were they really upset about about something real, or are they upset about things that they've read and understood online? I mean, there's now a real question, and I don't know the answer to it, about whether people are, whether people are really affected by reality, by the things that they encounter in their lives, in their jobs, in their private lives, or whether they are upset about things that they've learned about and discovered in the online world. And I don't know the answer. I mean, I fear that the online world is now just as powerful and just as emotive and moving as the real world. And so the question of what the real economy looks like and how people are really experiencing it I'm not saying it's not important or not significant, and at certain moments maybe it's the most important thing, but it's also not the only thing that's going on.
Yeah. All right, let's end with zooming way out beyond our borders and talk about the impact of this consolidating autocracy on the world. You wrote a beautiful and terribly distressing piece in The Atlantic called "This is What the End of the Liberal World Order Looks Like." Can you just talk a little bit about what you saw in Sudan and other places about what happens when when we lose this battle?
Sudan is a really fascinating and tragic example of a place in which there are now, in practice, no functional international institutions, no rule of law, no people, no outsiders who are working towards a solution to their civil war. On the contrary, Sudan is now a place of anarchy where a whole host of regional powers, they're not superpowers, they're sometimes called middle powers, are all seeking to gain whatever they can out of the fighting in Sudan, to sell weapons, to get hold of gold, to have political influence, and are amplifying and increasing existing conflicts. And those powers include Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Turkey, Egypt, but also Russia, which fights on both sides of the conflict, Iran, and others. And so what you get is a kind of anarchy. There's a sense that and nobody's coming to fix it. There are no American diplomats coming to set up a peace conference or start a negotiation. There's no UN. There's no representative of the UN Secretary General with the power or the influence to bring everybody to the table. There's really nothing. The outside negotiators that we got used to, who were sometimes pretty useless, but sometimes able to end wars, or who were at least trying to do that, they just don't exist at all anymore. And what you get is this kind of anarchy and despair and a kind of nihilism. People are simply there to make money, to steal what they can, and to get out. And I fear that model that I found in Sudan, we will begin to see in other places. And we already do see it in other places. Places like Libya or Yemen or Syria until recently are also subject to this kind of anarchy and nihilism.
Yeah. Failed states are very dangerous. We found that out to our horror as the training ground for 9/11. But if we don't have our own house in order, I guess we can't be very helpful anywhere else. And your work is essential for us. I don't know how you do it and get up in the morning every day looking at what you look at.
Thank you very much. Actually, I have lots of reasons to get up, and I also believe very much that nothing is inevitable. There's no such thing as historical determinism, and naming and identifying the problems can help us solve them and help us find the solutions. And I believe there are people who see solutions and are working towards them. So I don't mean for my work to cause despair. I mean for it to create ambition and engagement.
Yeah, I think it does, but it's hard to look at for sure. As I said at the beginning, you are our time's Hannah Arendt, explaining this horrid phenomenon. But unlike Hannah Arendt, you're doing it before it's too late.
I hope so. There are other reasons why a comparison to Hannah Arendt is worrisome, but thank you very much for the.
Yep. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.